Tears of the Kingdom is probably not only the most talked about game of the year, but also the most beloved one. Now, I, stizzl, am a person who loved Breath of the Wild to pieces. It's one of my top 3 favorite games of all time, so of course, when Tears of the Kingdom came out, I was extremely hyped and very much looking forward to the experience. But as you can see by the title of this video, my thoughts on Tears of the Kingdom are much more complicated than I initially thought they would be. How can a video game be the best and the worst in a series? I'll first talk about what I love most about the game and then go more into the more critical aspects of this review, video essay type of video. But now, without further ado, I will get into why Tears of the Kingdom is both the best and the worst 3D Zelda game ever made. As I said earlier, I am going to go from the best the game has to offer and then get to the more critical stages. And during the midpoint somewhere will be like the main thing I want to point out, the main obstacle this game has laid out for itself basically. And I will not only talk about the obstacles and what I think the game does right or wrong, but also how I think the game could have done things differently that would have resulted in, at least for me, way better experience. There are a lot of charming details that I could point out that really shaped my experience with this game. One of them being that first when you come down to Hyrule, I immediately went to the stable, and when I discovered that my horses from Breath of the Wild were still registered, that was such a neat and heartwarming detail. It's so weird to talk about this first, but for me this signified a huge appreciation for the players of Breath of the Wild. So it made my jaw drop, which is really weird, but it was like being reconnected with a friend. But now let's get into the major thing I want to talk about in this section, which are the abilities. Now, Recall and Ascend are the 2 abilities that I want to talk less about, because they're neat. They are neat, they fulfill their purpose. Recall seems to be an ability where I kind of have to go out of my way to use it outside of puzzles, but there have been 1 or 2 instances where I really depended on Recall. For example, at one point on a sky island, I was fighting a construct, and it was really strong, so it had really great loot. But when I beat it, the loot just flew off the edge. And then I remembered in time that I got Recall, so I chose Recall and just saw, basically 50 meters below me, 100 meters, I still saw one of the items, and I chose that one and it retracted all the way up basically. And then I still got the item, which was a really neat moment. But yeah, Recall, a nice ability I'd say. The same goes for Ascend. It's fun to find out where you can use Ascend and where not. The puzzles for it are somewhat samey, probably since this ability is kind of limited in its uses, but it's very fun, and I think in some cases it's very much puzzle breaking, especially if I'm in a shrine and I have to get up somewhere and I can utilize some kind of block. I just always hold it up, leave it in place with the Recall ability and just ascend up while it's in place. I don't know if that's the intended way, but it is definitely the most fun way. Then we got the Fuse ability, which was the most hyped up before launch, and it's still good. It's a fun ability. You can fuse so many things together. It totally is the main concept around combat. and it just works well for that. It basically makes the Breath of the Wild combats, the Tears of the Kingdom combat, a Breath of the Wild 1.5. And now let's go to the thing that the game does best, which is the Ultrahand ability. This might come as no surprise to many people here, because the Ultrahand ability has been the one that has been raved about the most online, and for very good reasons. You've probably all seen the clips on Twitter with like people doing the most insane shit, and while not may always be practical, Ultrahand still is just so much fun to mess around with. The fact that it's so open-ended makes you think that almost every solution you come up with is outside the box, is not what the developers intended. And that's just great because it just works so great, fusing everything together, making stuff from vehicles to weapons to fully automated mechas. Everything is possible, and it all works just as intended. It's insane how they were able to pull that off mechanically from a developer standpoint, because as little as I know about programming, I know that some of these things must have been a hassle to program, because you have to think about so many things, you have to make them work, the physics engine has to act strong all the time. I have only had like 1 or 2 times, maybe, in my 130 hours of playtime, where I was like, okay, maybe that's not how my vehicle should react to the environment, for example. But those have not only been far and few between, but also might have just been my mistake, because I don't know physics and shit, so like, maybe I was just wrong, to be honest. Yeah, so the Ultrahand ability is the major player of this game, and a lot of its riddles and overall quests and everything revolves around it. I think like over half is underestimating it. Probably like 70% of the game is dependent on the Ultrahand ability, and I think that's fine because the Ultrahand ability just works like a charm. A lot of the sonar devices you can use are just so fun to use. For example, the wing. I just think the wing is so fun when you first step on it, and you have this, when you clear the 3rd shrine and you use the wing to get back to the Sonai temple. That's just a really mesmerizing sequence, as you have to figure out how to fly the plane while flying it, which is insane. And I luckily knew, because of the previews, that you had to like use your weight and stuff, so I wasn't as anxious about it, but it was still a very intense experience, and I just loved using the wing in this sequence, and I continue to love using it, and that goes for a lot of the sonar devices. I think there are enough sonar devices for it to almost never get stale, and I think if you really wanted to, you can find ways to make new things for like years and years to come. So as soon as modders delete the cap of sonar devices you can use in one go, basically, you are in modding heaven. I think it will take a few years until we can play like something like Doom in Tears of the Kingdom, because technically that maybe is possible, because sonar devices at some point also kind of work like redstone, which means it also kind of works like computers, I guess. So yeah, I think through modding we'll see a lot of fun stuff. But yeah, that's it for the section about the game that I love the most, which is basically the Ultrahand ability. I think that's one more thing. I think the Ultrahand ability is the best ability in any Zelda game, and I think it might be one of the best abilities ever made in gaming, which sounds so much like hyperbole, but I really think that the Ultrahand ability is insane, and it's just a huge accomplishment by the developers of the game, so hats off to you. But now let's go into something I see a bit more critical, and I also go into how they could have changed it for it to be a better experience. What I'm speaking of are the dungeons. Dungeons have always been a staple of the series, and while I liked what Breath of the Wild did with the 4 divine beasts, or 5 with the DLC, I think that was very much an outlier. Very much, you know, seeing what works with this new approach, and then maybe taking feedback, taking their own thoughts, and then expanding on it. And by definition, they kind of did that, but I don't think they did that in a way that benefits the experience at all. And I think the changes they made to the dungeons, while the dungeons might even be overall on similar quality or maybe even slightly better than the Divine Beasts, do not even closely reach the heights that former Zelda games have reached with their dungeons. But now let's go through the dungeons one by one, and then I'll tell you about what I would change. So the first dungeon I visited was actually not the Rito one, because I kind of wanted to retrace my steps from Breath of the Wild a bit. So I actually went to the Zora dungeon first, and to my dismay actually, out of the 4 first major dungeons, this one is my least favorite. So a lot of the criticism I'm going to pull out for this one should not be applied as heavily to the other ones. But yeah, the water temple I think is kind of whack. You have your own gauntlets until you get there, but the water temple itself is just really short. That's something that goes for every dungeon. The dungeons are just way too short. I think the water temple is like, what, 30 minutes? If you mess around a lot, which I did because I was like, oh, maybe there's like hidden chests or something. You know, it's my first temple, I don't know what to do. But no, it's just very simple, I mean, there are some hidden chests, but like, very simple, just solve the thingamajigs and then you beat the boss. I think the whole vibe was just really off with this one. Just floating in the sky and being this open didn't feel like a water temple, but more like a playground to me. And that's one thing that I really do not like about these kinds of temples, is that there's no cohesion to them, no like cohesive storytelling within the dungeon. And I know using like storytelling and narrative as ways to describe dungeons is maybe kind of pretentious, but a lot of the other Zelda games have included dungeons where you like slowly introduced to the dungeon and you just have to fight and solve your way through the dungeon. Here it's like, hey, you're in the middle of the dungeon, you're basically where the boss will appear in 2 of the 4 major dungeons, and here's just 4 things that you'll have to go to, which are all easily solved and easily reached within like 2 minutes, and then you have, or like reached within 2 minutes and then solved within a few more minutes, and then you'll just beat the boss. And I think this really undercuts the vibe and feeling that I personally want to get out of a dungeon, because I want in a way to feel trapped, and I want to feel like the dungeon imposes itself upon the player, like the dungeon has some kind of leverage, which these dungeons do not have. I am free to go wherever, I'm free to do whatever. I don't feel like I'm in danger, I don't feel like this is the height, I don't feel like this is the climax of the current chapter I'm working towards. And that's something that I did notice with the Divine Beasts, but I think it's a more serious offender in this game just because they had time to define and refine the dungeon concept that they introduced with the Divine Beasts. So them doing this is kind of a letdown, to be honest. The boss itself is fine. I would sure hate to fight it another time because it would get annoying. I hope that's not going to happen with every boss in the game. But yeah, after all, you know, it's not a terrible dungeon, but it's just way too short, the vibe is totally off. Here's how I would solve it actually. So first of all, I think we should get some more linear dungeon progression. And with that, I don't mean that everything has to be room per room per room, but I want to have some sense of accomplishment throughout the dungeon that isn't just, oh, 3 terminals remain, 2 water gates, whatever, water gate, oh my god, remain. I kind of want chests and dungeon maps and compass and dungeon items to return. And in the case of the water temple, this would have been really easy. Let me paint a picture for you that's for me, would have been the perfect water temple. You walk in to the mountain below the water temple and you see ancient water temple. And then this eerie music starts playing. You know the music. This really distant singing that you kind of connect with ancient Zora tribe warriors and singers. As you scope out the size of the cave, you have to heighten and then maybe also lower again if you want to go get some chests later on the water level, so you get to that middle section. And in the middle section there's rather like a mini boss, and after beating this mini boss you get the dungeon item, which is you being able to travel on waterfalls. And then a gate opens up and the giant waterfall flows down from up above, and together with Sidon you're able to travel up that waterfall, and you see, oh my god, there's a second level to this. And of course you would have already known that if you picked up the dungeon map before, which would have been somewhere before, maybe even optional to be honest, and seen that there's like 2 or 3 stories to the dungeon that still remain. But still, I think this experience of being in this dungeon for like 20-30 minutes, maybe making it a bit longer than it is in the game, or making the section in the mountain a bit longer than it is in the game, adding like 2 or 3 more puzzles, that's enough. And then after like 20-30 minutes you get to that mini boss, you get the dungeon item, and then you're able to move towards the water temple. And you know, there's ways with devices and stuff to get around some barricades and maybe do one puzzle before the other. But the dungeon itself, the second part, would basically be set up like the first part, but just with, you know, 1 or 2 keys for large doors hidden away somewhere, or like large doors that, you know, more like, instead of like it being doors, it's more like high walls that could kind of like fade away as you open the gate basically. The upper rooms being maybe locked inside kind of a box that you maybe could get into from the top, but you know, it would be such a hassle that maybe you just wanna do it the way the dungeon intends you to. And then, you know, you solve the riddles, and then, you know, maybe there's 1 or 2 more, but to be honest, for a second dungeon half this would suffice, I think. And then you fight the boss and everything else stays the same, and that's it. And I think this would be such a good way to make this dungeon better. And basically all I did was connect the dungeon with what we had before, which, to be honest, can't be done as easily with the rest of the dungeons, but I think just showcases how cool of a moment that could have been, to kind of subvert the expectations with, okay, we're in this mountain now, this is the dungeon, then going 1000 meters up in the sky. And you might say, okay, but this is actually kind of what we got already. But I think this slight change in storytelling, this slight change in narrative changes a lot, because when I was in that mountain, I was like, oh, this is a dungeon? No, it isn't. Okay, it's just someplace. Guess the dungeon will be later on. And then you have this whole like walk up to the dungeon, which is also fun and could be considered part of the dungeon, but I do not consider it part of the dungeon, because every game, in every Zelda game, has had parts leading up to the dungeon that sometimes even play with some of the concepts you'll be thrown into at the dungeon. Again, I have to preface that I do not hate these dungeons. I think some of them are okay to good, but none of them are truly great. But this definitely was the weakest one out of the first 4. We'll go into Hyrule Castle and the Spirit Temple later. I think it's more about like it being a missed opportunity, because this dungeon in particular could have been way better if it had just connected the dots with the previous parts of the same main quest. That said, let's jump into something that really can't be reviewed or changed the same way, it being the Rito Temple. The approach to the Rito Temple differs from the Zora Temple because it really couldn't be integrated within the dungeon design-wise. It is very much, you know, kind of a platforming challenge. So it really acts like something you do before the dungeon that can't, even if you choose to name it that way, it really couldn't be considered part of the dungeon. and couldn't be integrated in a way that would fit well. So I think all the changes that I would like to make would have to be made within the dungeon itself, which of course is a higher workload for the developers, or would be. But still, with everything I'm going to say in this video, I think I'm only going to propose things that could have been done by the developers. Be it time, money, constraints. I have taken all of that into consideration. I'm not out here saying I would have liked 30 full-length dungeons and also every one of them has to be the best one in the series. No, that's not what I'm saying. But now let's get into the Rito dungeon. And I think the approach to the dungeon is very cool, and the sequence where you're just on top, just above of the eye of the storm, is bone chilling. It's awesome. It's very well paced in a way, because it just kind of takes away all of the momentum and all of the sounds and music, and just leaves you here hanging above the looming threat below as you slowly sink and slowly fall towards this dungeon. And that's just one of the best moments in the game, really. And then we get onto the dungeon, and it's supposedly the first one, or the first one that many will engage with. So it makes sense that it's the easiest one, and I do think that the puzzles overall and the continuity within the dungeon are a bit better than in the water temple, as there's like at least one puzzle where you have to solve the puzzle, and then in the location of that puzzle is actually a little way where you can go towards the next thingamajig. But still, I think this dungeon does disappoint in a way in its mechanics, because we're on this sky ship. And I would like to see the ship from the inside. Just like with the sand ship in Skyward Sword, which was quite a great dungeon actually. We got to see what the sand ship looked like from the inside. And we kind of do that with this dungeon as well. But the interior doesn't make any sense. It's just kind of there. Which is a shame, really, because it would have been so cool to kind of like have to fight your way through the different floors of this dungeon and all of it being contained on the ship. So I think this could have been made way better and just, again, longer. This dungeon is, I think, it's actually the same length as the water temple. So it's again too short, and I don't think they use the ship narrative at all. Why is there a ship? This could have been literally any other building. It's so like what's the point of it being a ship? Why is it just so we have something good to look at? Because I appreciate it to have something good to look at. It's better than, you know, walking around a textureless rectangle, but mechanically it could very well just be a textureless rectangle. It doesn't change how the dungeon is approached in any capacity, which is again a shame. We could have seen stuff like how the people of legend or the ancient Zora, they could have had their own dining rooms there, their own like living quarters, maybe even some ancient texts that kind of give insight into this ancient, did I say Zora? I meant Rito in this case, sorry, that give insight into this ancient tribe and what they were up to all these years ago. But then it's just kind of there. Oh, the ancient thing is there, and it's kind of, it's there. It doesn't do anything. We don't really get to feel and experience why it was there in the first place. There could have been so much cool stuff. Just saying like something like, okay, this is the arc, because it's an arc after all, so it would make sense to go after this kind of storyline. It's an arc with which the Rito escaped from a distant land after it was struck with war or some shit, and they kind of like were able to flee and then set up in Hyrule. That would be a nice piece of lore that maybe we could find there, but we don't, and we don't find anything else. It's just kind of a ship, and some parts of it are frozen, and there's this really cool looking boss inside that's really easy to beat, but still one of my favorite bosses of the game, because it's just you feel cool while fighting it, and that's all I want out of a first boss, really. But yeah, I think again, huge missed opportunity here to make it feel better. But now, this one, you know, is fine overall. It's fine. It's probably on the level of a Divine Beast in terms of quality. Now, for 2 dungeons that are better than the Divine Beasts, in my opinion. First up, let's start with the Lightning Dungeon, which was actually the one I got to the last. And I think this dungeon really nails the opening minutes. You go into it and you walk down this long staircase and you really feel like you're descending into something dangerous and sinister. And then the first 10-15 minutes are really fun as you have to fight Kibbles, have to do a few puzzles here and there. You could maybe even already hide the map here somewhere so you can see like, oh god, this dungeon is actually way bigger than I intended and there's this huge middle room that I will go to. So yeah, I think they really nailed the introduction to the dungeon. But then after the 50 minutes, after you've gotten to the main room of the dungeon, it's already half over because there's like 3 puzzles remaining, because there's like 4, I think it's 4, it might be 5, of these thingamajigs that you have to use, whatever. And let me just say, hiding one of the thingamajigs just behind a wall is kind of lazy. It's like, this is a wall, the wall is gone now because you used the Ultrahand ability. That's 1/5 or 1/4, I don't know, of the remaining dungeon. So yeah, this dungeon's main flaw is that it's way too short. Like, I was in it, I was into it, I was ready, and I think it might be the shortest dungeon of them all. I'm not sure, I mean, from the first 4, it might be the shortest dungeon. And that's a shame really, because they could have done so much cool stuff with this concept of there being a middle room and then you having multiple ways to go. And they even could have kept the multiple ways thing, in my opinion. Could have just made each route twice as long, and then we could have had a dungeon that's like 50 minutes overall instead of 30, which would be way better, because this way I was out as soon as I was in basically, which is again a shame. But overall, still the vibe of this dungeon is just way better. Maybe it's just because it's not so open, so you feel a bit more locked in, and I really appreciated that approach again. Regarding items, by the way, or like dungeon items, the retail dungeon item would have been like Tulins using the Gust of Wind. And you know, I'm kind of mixing Sage abilities with like clothing items. You know, it's a video game, they do the story, they do the mechanics, they could have done whatever they wanted to, so I can also do whatever I want to, as long as I think it's feasible. You could have used the lightning technique as a thing that we can only do within the dungeon, or like from the dungeon onward, but I think it would have been better and if we had gotten some kind of mirror shield again, that we just keep, you know. It's fine if we can keep 1 or 2 things. Yeah, so maybe there could have been some puzzles with the light beforehand, and then at some point you get the dungeon item and the mirror shield, which works the same way as it did in the previous 3D games, and we could have just utilized it to get better angles. Yeah, that would be my thing, and then you could use it for the boss fight to reflect the light into the Gipto Mother's face, in the Gipto Queen's face, and then it would make the fight easier or some shit. So yeah, I think the dungeon is fine, but could have still improved majorly by just being longer. And my favorite out of the 4 dungeons, and my favorite overall, is the Goron dungeon, which I didn't think would be the case, because normally I'm not too hot on like the fiery dungeons, but this one was actually really good, mostly because it was the most complex one, and it really felt like you had some kind of cohesion to it, not only because you get a shortcut in the middle, which I really appreciated, but also because just the way it's laid out, it really makes you feel like you should go from bottom to top. And of course you can circumvent it with like building devices and stuff like that, but I think that's fine. I think for what Tears of the Kingdom wants to be, that's fine. If you don't want to deal with all of this, you can still carve your own path. That's what it's all about after all. But I think it's good that this dungeon kind of presents you with an intended way of solving this. It makes it feel, again, way more cohesive. There's still enough branching paths here and there. and I just felt way more accomplished each time I got to a higher floor. So I just think this dungeon worked way better overall. The only thing that I would change that would make this dungeon way better is, again, you know, introducing something like keys, something like dungeon items, map, compass, all of these items that just give you a little boost, a little reward, and just make you feel like you're conquering the dungeon bit by bit, instead of, you know, having everything from the get-go, basically. The ability here could of course be the Goron Smashy ability, so maybe we could be able to use certain types of bombs that are only found here for like the first few rock formation thingies, but then at some points there's no bomb near, so we have to fight the mini boss, get the ability, and then we can go back and go forth and destroy the remaining rocks, and then open the door to get to the boss. Which was also a nice callback, because Goma, again, I love to see Goma, and it's been a while, it's been since Armored Goma, I think, and that was like, what, 17, 18 years ago? So nice to see Goma back, and in very much a design that doesn't really resemble a spider, but it's really fitting for the dungeon, so I really like this boss. The Gipto Queen itself, by the way, was a bit, not boring, but annoying, because it kept spawning enemies, so that's probably not up there with the Caldera, whatever it's called, and the Marbled Goma. But yeah, I really liked the Goron dungeon, it was good. One of the better ones. If I compare like to Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword, would it have been in the top 3 or 4 of those games? Probably not, but I also really like the dungeons in those games. That also, you know, goes a long way to show that I really appreciate just the longer dungeons. Like even dungeons that are really complicated, like the 3rd dungeon in Twilight Princess. I just really appreciate how long that dungeon is, because it really feels like I have to overcome something gargantuan, Giganosaurus, God. But yeah, those were the 4 dungeons. Then what I really liked about the 5th dungeon was there was over soon. No, was the fact that once we got into the throne room, I was afraid of it being the final dungeon, and I knew that Ganondorf was down below, so I was like, no, it can't really be the final dungeon now, can it? But yeah, I really liked that it was just Phantom Ganon, that was a nice callback. Too bad that Phantom Ganon appears infinitely throughout the game. I would have appreciated it if it would have just been the one time. You don't have to reuse the same couple of bosses so often, but we'll get into that later. The dungeon itself doesn't hit at all at a similar level than Hyrule Castle did in Breath of the Wild, just because we had already seen it in Breath of the Wild. All of these things, like, you know, finding out Zelda's room, finding the secret room of King Bosforam, Bosfolosfo, whatever. All of these things, you know, still were there, but I had already discovered them in the previous game, you know, so there wasn't really anything noteworthy. And, you know, Phantom Ganon sending us to fight all these enemies is kinda annoying as well. I don't think it should have been a dungeon here in the first place. I think it should have been changed. Maybe they could have just fucking blown Hyrule Castle up, and then we could have walk through its ruins on our way to the final boss in like a separate kind of dungeony vibe. The ruins could have fallen to the underground basically. That could have been cool, I guess. But I'm just spitballing. Yeah, this dungeon for me just didn't hit it at all, and I was glad that we got the chance to see a 5th dungeon. A 5th real dungeon apart from Hyrule Castle. I was like, yes, let's go, main quest. But then I kind of disliked the main quest. I think the part on the surface was fine. The part in the clouds was also alright. But then the construct factory, the riddles were cool, but again, the vibe was just not there. It just felt really disconnected. Like, you would just go through like 4 shrines. And since people seem to lump it together with the Spirit Temple, I don't. For me, it was just part of the main quest that resembles the shrine and how it's built up with its like, oh, go to these 4 places. And I feel like the developer wants me to believe that this is part of the Spirit Temple. But think about it. The Spirit Temple is like 12 nautical miles away from here. I did not connect these two dots at all. And I don't think that I'm really to blame for this. That if I go to the Spirit Temple and then see the words Spirit Temple appear on screen, that I expect more than a boss fight out of what is to follow. I expected a full-blown dungeon. Is it my mistake for misinterpreting what the developers wanted me to think when entering this dungeon? I'm not sure, but to be honest, I think this way of telling what is a dungeon and what is not is kind of muddled, because again, the core part of this quote-unquote dungeon is half across the map. So I didn't count it, and I'm only going to count the Spirit Temple for what it is. And it is a boss fight. A fine one, you know, a funny one. Let's say a funny gimmicky one, yes. Very easy though, but like there's nothing to the Spirit Temple. And if I go into a dungeon and it's called Spirit Temple, I expect the coolest possible stuff, and not only a boxing match. That's by far the worst dungeon, and since I am seeing it outside of the Construct Factory, there's no surprise that this is the worst dungeon in any Zelda game. I don't think there's anything that comes close, and even if I count the Construct Factory, I just think that there's no vibe at all. That there's nothing that gives off dungeon vibes except it being, you know, these 4 points and you having to collect the 4 things, like with the Divine Beast and with the other dungeons in this game. Most of the other dungeons, you know, except Hyrule Castle. But even then, you know, I don't get the vibe of it being a main dungeon. I just get the vibe of just kind of running around and running to the golden points and solving some good and hard puzzles, but this was not a dungeon. I don't care if you count the Construct Factory, count it separately, whatever, this was not it. This was so weak. So sadly, this was a disappointment, and I think the only way to change this is to take some of the puzzles from the Construct Factory, move it to the Spirit Temple, have it all in like one location, the Spirit Temple, and then changing around the feel of the dungeon, changing around a lot of the connectivity issues, making the dungeon then again larger after all, and it would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. And I see why you probably can't really do that, but that's what I'm proposing, yeah. One thing that also is a big disappointment that I hadn't really talked about until now is that there's no unique dungeon exclusive enemies except the bosses. Like, I always love to see some dungeon exclusive enemies. Just be like, okay, what kind of evil manifests in there? But for these dungeons, it's just these Zonai constructs that kind of disturb you here and there just with the Divine Beasts. But I think it made more sense narratively within the Divine Beasts than it made with these ancient temples, because I feel like they could have been inhabited by anything really. And to see over the years, you know, maybe what has manifested in there could have been really cool, but wasn't the case. The only dungeon that has enemies that aren't constructs, discounting Hyrule Castle again, is the Lightning Temple, and it has the Kibbles, which have like a good atmosphere, and I really love what they did with their design and their more like insecty approach. I think that's great, but they are really easy once you find out the weaknesses. So yeah, that's it for the dungeon part of this video. The dungeons overall are just mid. If I go from like Ultrahands, giving Ultrahand a 10 out of 10, and maybe the abilities overall actually also like a 10 out of 10, maybe 9 out of 10, I have to give the dungeons like a 5, which, given how strict I was about the dungeons just now, might seem like a high score actually, but I don't think so, because the dungeons normally in the Zelda games, like overall, if I had to give them a score, they range between like 7 and 9, 7 and 10. So if a dungeon has like on average a 5, it means that I really didn't enjoy my time with them too much, which is a shame because I feel like the dungeons are one of the high points of most Zelda games. Let's get into the big one now. I sound so sad starting this chapter, but this is the big problem that I have with Tears of the Kingdom. And it's a problem that manifests itself in various aspects of the game, but there's one that sticks out that I'm going to talk about first, and then there's going to be other ones that I'm going to talk about in separate chapters that also kind of inherit the same problem, or that have problems that kind of have the same source, or a similar source at least. A lot of what makes Tears of the Kingdom great was what made Breath of the Wild great. Why is this a problem? Well, let me explain. In Breath of the Wild, every single discovery, even the most minute details, were something I was really happy about, something I got really hyped about. You know, the first time chopping a tree, the first time finding out what different items do, the first time finding and taming a horse, the first time finding the horse god, the first time finding the great fairies, the first time finding Satori or the dragons, the first time finding a shrine, a divine beast, the first time finding the master sword, the first time going to Hyrule Castle, the first time seeing how the different races look in this game, Goron, Zora, Rito and Gerudo, and where they are located on the map, the first time really exploring and experiencing Hyrule, is one of the best experiences I have ever had with a video game. This is why Breath of the Wild is in my top 3 video games of all time. Tears of the Kingdom tries to replicate this by using the same map, and I don't think this works at all. And I have seen many videos and many takes that for many people it did work, and I am glad it worked for so many people, but I do not understand how and why. Of course, there are some changes that have been made to the map of Breath of the Wild in Tears of the Kingdom. The changes sometimes being really magnificent, really great ones, and sometimes not so much. But overall, there are many parts that you will recognize from Breath of the Wild if I just show a screenshot. But other parts have been revamped quite extensively. But that's not enough. I think there's a core problem of reusing the map, and that is that I don't feel like I'm exploring something. It feels like I am returning to something that is very familiar and then seeing what is the same and what isn't. And while there are some major changes, there are so many things that stayed the same. There's so many items that have just stayed the same, that I know the result of when I'm cooking them. So there's no excitement for me anymore when I cook stuff, because I already know what I'm going to get. Of course, there's like 10 or 20 new things here and there, and that goes for different categories of items. For example, armor and stuff like that as well. But the core experience of finding something out on your own is gone, at least for 90% of it. The same goes for weapons. A lot of the weapons are just the same. Getting like a Gerudo shield in Breath of the Wild, hype as shit. Getting it in Tears of the Kingdom, familiar. The same goes for the different kinds of armor you can get. In Breath of the Wild, every piece of armor was new and unique. In Tears of the Kingdom, almost all of them are reused. There are some new ones, granted, but 80 to 90% of them are just what we had before. So I only felt good about obtaining the new ones because I already had the old ones in Breath of the Wild, so I already know which ones of them are really good, which ones of them aren't, so I knew how to feel about the ones I got. And I didn't feel like I got that much joy out of them because I'd rather try on some new armor. But there wasn't that much to choose from, which is really sad in my opinion. And this extends to other stuff as well. If I walk around in the open world, you know, shrines are still there at different locations, of course, because they're different shrines, but it's still shrines. You still know all of the monsters that you are about to fight. There really aren't that many new ones. There's like the flying ones that die in one hit, 1 or 2 in the underground, which we'll get into later in detail, but not a lot new stuff. Like the first time fighting a Stone Talus, the first time fighting a Hinox, the first time fighting a Stahl enemy, all of these are great experiences that I can't have because I had them in Breath of the Wild. And even though there were like major changes for the Talus and no changes basically for the Hinox, it didn't give me the same feeling. It was just, yeah, okay, there's the thing, the stone, guess I'll use Ascend, okay, it worked, fine. It actually got easier now, cool. And there's still some normal Talus tally, there's some normal tally as well. So yeah, a lot of the new experiences aren't so new. The same goes for like the dragons. When I first found the dragons in Breath of the Wild, it was insane. I just heard this ethereal music coming in. I was like, oh, what's happening? Then I saw the wind, decided to move up with my paraglider, and then I just saw this huge ass dragon in front of me. That was insane. And then, you know, you find out that you can shoot it, because of course I'm going to shoot at wild animals. Don't shoot at wild animals, please. So, you know, finding out that you can get the claw, the horn, the scale, that's really fun. And, you know, when I first saw Dragon Tears of the Kingdom, I was like, ah, you're still there, that's good. Good to see you doing well. You know, shooting it still results in the same things. They kind of travel underground now as well, kind of, but it doesn't really matter because it doesn't change the way I interact with them at all. So what's the point really? There's a fourth dragon, of course, and we'll get into the story in a bit. So I was like, ah, there's a fourth dragon. That's odd, nice, cool. Same goes for Satori. There's still these kind of things there, now with a bit of a different purpose, but kind of stays the same. And that's it for a lot of this game. A lot of it is repurposing the stuff we've seen before, and while it works in some regards, it doesn't work in others. Now, since we're speaking about the open world, I also want to throw in mentions about the caves and the wells, which at first are really cool. I really like the design of the caves visually and from a level design perspective, because I don't think they ever repeat, they ever really one-on-one copy one another, and there are some fun puzzles throughout, but what I don't like is that the visual design very much stays the same, but for like all but like a few caves, maybe if I'm being lenient. Like the one at Hyrule Castle kind of has something different going on, but still has the like same design palette. So I think like just the palette swap would have been cool, and then maybe just giving us more to do in them. Like, you know, sometimes you find like a piece of armor, but I feel cheated if I find a piece of armor that I also had in Breath of the Wild. It doesn't feel rewarding to me, because I was like, oh, I didn't use it in Breath of the Wild, huh, okay. So I feel a bit cheated when it comes to the caves. And we also get those bubble gems, which are not really that useful, to be honest. They're fine, I guess. Caves are kind of there just to be there, in my opinion. They do give us the horror blinds, which are fun. And you know, there are some caves which do a bit of a different approach with, like Death Mountain has like one or two that feel different enough. But still, there's not a lot of reason for me to go into them, to be honest. And the same goes for wells, actually. Like, wells for the most part just have ore, maybe a few resources otherwise, maybe a cool weapon, but there's not really a lot of reason for me to go there in the first place. There were like one or two wells that I really wanted to go into, like for example the well in where we lived in Breath of the Wild, where then Zelda resided for the time being. Like that was a cool well, and I think was a cool section of the game. But overall the wells just feel kind of fillery. I don't see how they are giving the game anything of value besides being more stuff to do. I have grown out of the mindset of just having stuff to do is enough for an open world game. I think I could stomach it within Breath of the Wild because it again was the first time, so everything felt new and fresh. But after having played 250 hours of Breath of the Wild, I can't say the same about Tears of the Kingdom. And this is the main thing that I want to talk about. And again, I'll get into this in more detail why I think this is the case. But I think I've laid the groundwork for me to now go into what I mean by the title. I think Tears of the Kingdom might be the best game in the series, the best 3D game, if you've never played Breath of the Wild. Because a lot of Tears of the Kingdom is built upon that same or similar feeling that Breath of the Wild gave me. But by having been given that feeling in Breath of the Wild, I cannot get the same feeling in Tears of the Kingdom, or get it just few and far between, just glimpses at what I believe majority of people are feeling right now. People that haven't played Breath of the Wild, or people that have just forgotten some details of Breath of the Wild, but I think that's where the major problem is. There's just too much for me that's similar. And this also goes into like the core geography. Like, of course, things have changed for the different tribes, and for example, for like the Gerudo, I really liked how they implemented those changes, but it still means like, okay, we're going to the Zora, we're going to the Rito, we're going to the Gorons, we're going to the Gerudo. I still know where all of them are, and of course the map also marks it, but still, you know, I know where they are, I know what they look like, I know the characters. And the characters don't have that much personality to them to carry the whole thing. You know, some have, like the core champions are fine, but I don't think they have enough weight to them to warrant us just basically retracing our steps from Breath of the Wild. And that also goes into what I said about the dungeons, that the first instinct I had was to just retrace my steps from Breath of the Wild, because I didn't feel like I was visiting new locations, I felt like I was revisiting old ones, because that's what it is. Another thing that kind of ties in with this is kind of a side quest with the Master Sword, and having to retrieve it from the Lost Woods, and that again is in Breath of the Wild a huge thing. A huge, awesome quest. But in Tears of the Kingdom, it's just similar. It's just in the same location, so you know where you have to go. So what's the point? There's no exploration there. There's, of course, this kind of puzzle that you have to travel there underground, but it doesn't stand out that much, in my opinion. Which, again, is really sad, because I really did look forward to this game a lot. But for the next part, let me actually diffuse a claim that has been made about this game, which is that this game is to Breath of the Wild what Majora's Mask was to Ocarina of Time, being a more focused and story-focused game. Focused and story-focused kind of separately, actually. And let's go into the story so I can refute this claim. And then we're also going to get into, before I forget it, we're also going to get into how to fix the map problem. The story of Tears of the Kingdom has Link revisit all of these locations and kind of has him do the same stuff again. Like, we still got the champions. 3 out of the 4 are just the same champions, or like sages in this case. And then, of course, there's Mineru, the last sage, but we're not talking about the Spirit Temple anymore, I can't stomach it. And we're just doing the same thing, just kind of, oh, a bad thing happened at X location. Let's go to X location and solve that bad thing. And then after it's done, we move to Y location. I think Ludwig said it best.
Demon King. Secret stone.
This game is fun, don't get me wrong. It is probably worth playing because of how fun it is. But I feel like the plot of it is I'm going to meet 4 people who are all like special chosen people in their village to get to a boss that's wreaking havoc on their area. They meet some ancestor and then they have the same voice lines. Like, I'm calling it right now. The next time we reach a dungeon, the 3rd dungeon, it's gonna be like, Demon King, Tear, what are you talking about? Like, it's gonna be the same exact voice line.
All right, are you guys ready for it? Demon King? Secret stone? What are you talking about?
Secret stone? Demon King?
What are you talking about, Goro?
Again, if it's your first game and you haven't played Breath of the Wild, this is cool. But for me, it was just like, okay, so we're doing the same thing over again, just with like a bit of a different like set dressing around it. You might say that's me because there's so much that happens in the past. And I actually made a video about that, remember? I said that my biggest fear would be that a lot of the story of this game plays in the past. And turns out my fear was right. It's the same thing as in Breath of the Wild. And again, while in Breath of the Wild, I do see now how this is a flaw and how this could have also been made better in Breath of the Wild. The flaws just stand out much more if you do it twice, and arguably even worse this time, because the story itself has some interesting story beats, right? With Zelda traveling back in time, meeting Ganondorf, witnessing the betrayal, all of this stuff. So my question is, why can't we experience it? It's just Link standing in the middle of a field being like, oh my god, this Ganondorf guy is really evil. Link could have easily fit into this narrative. And I'm going to talk about the solution right now. Zelda, you know, the historian that she is, travels to the Sona ruins in the south of Hyrule and finds out that there's an ancient Sona country to the east, or to insert random location, and we can travel to that. And then we don't only see that, but we see that Ganondorf is actually, the real body of Ganondorf is actually located there, or some shit. You can make up the story. It's literally a Zelda game. It can, you can bend it to your will however you like. And we do like a bit of stuff there, maybe hang out with some of the new citizens of this dilapidated country, do 1 or 2 dungeons, maybe even with Zelda together. And then we get traveled back in time as we find the real Ganondorf. Both of us travel back in time, but get separated. And Link maybe has an Ocarina of Time situation where he can travel between the 2 times again. And then we have like a really focused narrative with like the king really trusting Ganondorf, and us having to play along, and maybe even, you know, you could maybe even go into a dungeon with Ganondorf and solve some kind of problem or some shit. Again, you can do whatever you want with the story, you know, whatever thingamajigs you have to collect, it doesn't matter. And then after all, you know, Ganondorf just wanted the thingamajigs for his own good and betrays the king, kills the queen, and then you can basically take it from there. Maybe we have to reunite with Zelda in the past, maybe in the present. You can still have the dragon narrative if you want to, because that's a cool thing, I think. It would be so involved, because once you then go back to the real world, or go to wherever and whenever you'd fight the real Ganondorf, you'd have stakes. You'd feel connected because you were there and you weren't able to change a thing. You were there, you knew Zelda was gone, you knew Ganondorf was bad because you had seen it in the future, but no one believed you. And now everything has gone to shit, and you can't change that. You can only change the future from here on out. You can change that, at least for this lifetime, at least for this Link and Zelda, things will turn out good. I think this narrative would have been way more compelling, or this kind of narrative. Again, the details don't matter. Just let Link do the stuff himself instead of just hearing about it on a hillside, or like next to Impa, and Impa then being like, oh, had some hallucinations again, Link? And yeah, I do like what Zelda does with like the oh, I'm becoming a dragon kind of thing, and then having the Master Sword inside her head. I think that's really cool, visually a really nice set piece. It is resolved very easily, because having lived as a dragon for 10,000s of years, and then for Zelda to be like, I don't remember a thing. Zelda maybe being changed in some capacity would have fit, I think, if you had taken enough time to flesh out the characters, which I think they didn't do. And that's a shame, because especially like Ganondorf is just wasted. You see him in the memories, which, you know, the memories are questionable sometimes. And you see him once at the start of the game, once after the 4 dungeons, and then at the end when you fight him. So there's like 3 conversations you have with him as a whole, which also undermines what Ganondorf is doing the whole time, because the whole time during the game he just sits there and tries to revitalize himself for the final fight, only to lose anyway. That's whack as fuck, I think. I mean, he still tries to like fool Link by having Phantom Gun and whatever, but it's not really a tactic or plot befitting the Demon King, just, you know, sitting there, meditating, getting stronger. That could have been a part of what he wants to do, but apart from like conquering the world, it's nothing there really. And you could argue like, okay, past Zelda games had also really simple storylines, and you'd be right, but they had something going for them. You know, a bit of a sense of wonder at least. Twilight Princess, you had Sand, who really takes the show as being like a creepy villain and kind of like a subordinate of Ganondorf. In Skyward Sword you had Girahim, which also is an at least outstanding in the most literal sense of the word character, and there's more to the story just because we are not retracing the steps of a previous game. There's still a lot of new stuff to discover in either of those games, even though I have like many gripes with those games as well, don't get me wrong. But with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, it just is too similar. The story just feels like they've thought about it for a day and then it was finished and that's it. And there's a lot of awkward moments in it, with like after every dungeon the same dialogue occurring. It's just really hard after a while to get invested at all in this story. Because I wasn't invested at first. When I first went out to Lookout Tower, I was in, I was hooked, but then there's not a lot to hook onto really. And now to go back to the claim that this is to Breath of the Wild what Majora's Mask is to Ocarina of Time. This would only be true if Majora's Mask's story would be very similar to Ocarina of Time's story and also would play in the same land as Ocarina of Time. Now of course changed with the moon maybe still falling down, with a lot of changes to the overworld, but this would be a connection. This would then work as a comparison. But as it stands, Tears of the Kingdom just, again, takes something from Breath of the Wild and just remixes it. Another thing I want to mention are 2 big changes to this game that have been hyped up before and after release: the sky and the depths. Let's talk about both of them and why I, again, don't really like them. The first time you travel into the depths is again one of the best moments in the game, as you dive into this deep dark hole and you're just alone there, and the music and atmosphere conveys this perfectly. It's pitch black, you can just look around, you see this one route, you go there, light it, you see a bit of light now, you feel a bit of relief, but you're still scared shitless because you have no idea how to traverse through this. Then you find out how to tackle all of this, and it gets a lot less stimulating and fun the further on we go. As you know, the depths is as big as the whole overworld of Hyrule, and it doesn't have nearly as much variety to it. So while Hyrule exploring it the second time isn't as much fun at all as in Breath of the Wild, exploring the depths is even less fun, because there's not much to do. The most fun I had was fighting the Yiga outposts, because that's something where you get something useful out of it, being the Yiga blueprints, which you can actually use quite often, so those are great. But otherwise, you just got the ore deposits, you got like 1 or 2 cool quests playing there, but nothing warranting the like 80 square kilometers map size. Jesus Christ. There's the same enemies, just gloomified. There's one new overworld boss, or underworld boss in this case, which is a good boss, but only one, and up above we only got the Gleeok as an additional overworld boss. There's 1 or 2 cool sections with like the huge bargainer statue kind of thing. No locations really give you a experience that feels thought out. All of it is just kind of, oh, here under the Satori thing, I think it was, are the barrows where you got some of the Satori rabbit thingies. Great. There's of course still the Colosseums, which are fine. I think they're fun actually. One of them I still gotta solve, like the Lionel one. That's kind of hard, not gonna lie. I'm not gonna Lionel to you. But then reusing fights from the main story just decreases the value they had, because all of the main story boss fights are just splattered throughout the game. And of course, you know, it's to farm the materials and it's to get the charges so you can blah blah blah. But that's arbitrary. You can just change the rules around that. You can change how this game is designed. That's not a reason for you to copy paste major bosses, the only major bosses, 5, 6, 7 times each. It really devalues every fight, even though it's harder fights, even though they have more health. It just doesn't add anything. I'm like, okay, why the fuck would you be here? Why the fuck wouldn't you go up and be a menace to Hyrule like you're supposed to be? Why are the weakest specimen of your race the ones that are wreaking havoc when all of you combined could supposedly probably just wipe out Hyrule as a whole? It just really hurts the already tumbling narrative. I'm really struggling to find anything positive about the depths, really, beyond the first time you go into it. How I would solve it is by just making it way smaller. This also goes for the supposed solution for the main story and Hyrule as a whole, because I was like, okay, travel between time, and that sounds exhausting to program, but I would also just make Hyrule way smaller. If you can travel between two Hyrules and have an underground and a sky, there's no reason for any of those parts together to exceed 80 square kilometers. In this game we got 80 square kilometers plus 80 square kilometers in depths, plus the sky islands, plus the shrines. You could easily scrape off a lot of the stuff I have just mentioned and make it a more cohesive and focused experience. And that doesn't mean like not an open experience. You could still have it like open and have it like you can go wherever you want, but just some kind of more purpose would have been nice. Then there's one thing that connects the Sky Islands to the depths, which is also my main gripe with the Sky Islands, is that in the Sky Islands you often see these smaller islands that contain a treasure map for below, and then you travel below, and then there's a treasure there, and it's one of the armor pieces that we already had in Breath of the Wild, or most of the time we already had them in Breath of the Wild. So I'm like, okay, so you just wasted 2 locations, a mine below, most of the time a mine, and a sky island above, so I get an item that I already had in Breath of the Wild. That's just reusing the stuff. That's not good game design. That's patting out the game beyond belief, and as, you know, subjective as I am in this review, because again, a lot of people disagree with me on this, I think that's just as objective as it can be, just kind of like lazy. Like, there's nothing to it. Go to this island, there's a treasure map there, then it shows you in the depths, then go to the depths. It's just trying so hard to make the depths and make the sky purposeful that by doing this it achieves the absolute opposite. I would rather have way less of both, but have it be way more purposeful and way more unique. You know, there are some pieces of the sky that I think work really well. There are these spheres that are quite cool to travel through. And also, just to mention the shrines, you know, if I don't mention something in this review, then I just think it's good. Or like it didn't leave a lasting impact. You know, music, shrines, visuals, all still good. I got nothing to complain here. I just really want to focus on the stuff that I really have a strong opinion about, because otherwise I'd be the one patting the runtime of this video, so but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that works with the Sky Islands, but even more things that don't. Like, there's a lot of Sky Islands that just don't have any purpose at all, or just have like 2 or 3 fruits or something like that. There's a few with like Sage's Wills, which are cool. And the huge ones, the ones we were most hyped about, just turned out to be main story missions or dungeons. So that was kind of a letdown, because I didn't feel like I had the ability to explore something cool in the sky, because all of the cool different set pieces were fixed set pieces for the main story. I thought that maybe one or two of those could just be optional stuff that I could tackle. Like maybe even an optional dungeon. Like hell, I don't know. There's of course the Sonar device dispensers, which are cool. I like them. I like finding out the different Sonar devices and having a place to get them easily. That's good. But apart from that, there's a lot of there's like these star-shaped islands which are just used for a side quest. There are a lot of islands without any purpose at all. There are a lot of islands that kind of reuse the same geometry over and over again. So I'm like, this is the sky. The only thing that was really great about the sky were the dungeon set pieces and the Great Sky Island, which we start out on, and on which there's not really a lot of reason to return to. Except if you want wings for the one dispenser, because that's one that's really close by and just really viable, so hell yeah. But otherwise, there's just not a lot to do, and the same goes for the depths, even though the depths is just so huge. So again, how would I have solved this in my theoretical Tears of the Kingdom game? Just take the sky, put it in this other kingdom, the same with the depths, and just have it be smaller and more concise and condensed. There's no reason for an open world game to be extremely huge and then not have a lot to offer. The new place we visit could still be like half as big as Hyrule if they wanna go insane. But then the depths should only be like quarter as big or an eighth as big, and the sky should also not be as huge, and you'd still find so much to do. Like for example, in Elden Ring, I think the whole map, everything included, legacy dungeons and normal dungeons and underground stuff, is as large as Hyrule, like just the overworld, and I never felt as though Elden Ring was too small. Like that's something I never felt. And I do get that from a design perspective. You can't make an open world game that is so densely packed that you feel anxious just traveling through it, because you don't want to go 2 seconds and have something happen. You need a bit of space to let everything breathe. And I think Breath of the Wild did it well, and Tears of the Kingdom also does it well on the overworld, because it's the same overworld, but in the depths there's not only space to breathe, there's no space to do something else really. Like sometimes you go 10 minutes without seeing anything that's really interesting. If you talk about really interesting, you could go hours without seeing anything really interesting, which again is a shame. I hate to end this video on a sour note, because I feel like, I don't know if this video is gonna reach more than 1,000 people. I never know how these videos are going to be perceived by the public. I haven't done these long videos at all. And I haven't written a script for this, as you can see. I just talked from memory, just from like my thoughts and my brain and my wrinkles and stuff like that. But as you can see, I have a lot of thoughts about this video game, and I have a lot of thoughts about other video games as well. So if you want to see, I have a lot of thoughts about this game, and I am sad that it disappointed me, because I really wanted to love this game. I was really looking forward to it. It wasn't like I got into this with unreal expectations. Because, again, I think like a lot of what I proposed, what I would have liked more, is doable, is feasible, and is not too much to ask of these developers that already can do so much, and have shown it time and time again with the previous Zelda games, this one partially included. You can say, okay, then this game wasn't made for you, but I honestly don't really get how this was made for Breath of the Wild players at all, because again, there's so much that just takes away from the experience if you have played Breath of the Wild before it. A lot of the stuff doesn't come down to objectively good or objectively bad. It's just that they had a vision for this game, a creative vision that I severely disagree with in many accounts, and you might have a totally different opinion. You might think everything I just said was stupid and out of proportion and just untrue, and it's your favorite game of all time, and I am very, very happy for you. I wish it were my favorite game. I wish it were my top 5 games I played in the last 3 months. Even though I'm so harsh on it, and I have been really harsh in my wording for this game, I still like it. Not more, not less. I don't think it's just okay. I don't think it's great. I like it. Which again, for me, is probably around the same level I would give Skyward Sword, and those two are like right on the bottom at the 3D Zelda games list. With the other games just being above it / miles above it in terms of my enjoyment of it. And you know, it's okay that I didn't love this game. It's okay to be disappointed in a game that you were really looking forward to, because that's also part of experiencing art. Some of it you just don't like, or you just don't vibe with to the extent you thought you would. Be it a record of your favorite artists going into a different direction than you would have liked them to, or a movie having a different kind of cinematography than you would have liked to. The same goes here for Tears of the Kingdom, going into various different directions than I would have liked to. And while I do think that my game, even if they had like applied half of the changes, or would apply half of the changes for a future game, would outshine Tears of the Kingdom in almost every aspect, especially if they kept the Ultrahand ability in the game. I am glad that it's doing well. I'm glad that so many people are enjoying it. This is why I'm so sorry to say that I don't think I'll ever return to this game. I think after 130 hours, I have had enough. And again, as sad as it is, it's okay. So, this video has been a chonky wonky of a video, a chumbus if you will, in size. Jesus Christ. Can you notice that I have been recording for almost 2 hours? It's been a great long video to make. I haven't actually made it, I'm just recording all of the audio right now. I think it went really well this time, because I did record it once before, over 2 hours long, and then I listened back to it and I didn't really like it. Not what I said, but like some of it just didn't sit right with me. So I re-recorded it all, and now it's out there. And thank you so much if you've made it this far into the video. Maybe also give it a like, or even a dislike. Like, it's still engagement, right? So no, but like a like, maybe a comment on your thoughts of the game. You can go as in depth as you want. I'll read through as many as I can, depending on how many people watch this video. Maybe it will just be 500, then I can read all of the comments. If it's more than that, then, you know, I will try my best. If you do like these kinds of videos, I'll try to do more video essay stuff in the future, because I think it kind of suits my style of video making. I think it's kind of nice to kind of branch out from Hollow Knight stuff. I'll still do Hollow Knight and Silksong stuff, don't you worry, and as soon as Silksong comes out, this channel will go into full blast mode for Silksong. But yeah, until then, I'll just do whatever I feel like, to be honest. And if you want to support me further than just liking and subscribing, you can also check out my Patreon. It's just $1 or €1, I don't know, it's one of the two. It's just one of a currency. If you do have $1, then please consider it, I'd really appreciate it. And that said, that's it for me. This has been one hell of a video to record. It's been fun though, and I hope you also had fun, even though you may have disagreed with me severely. Please be constructive with your criticism of the game and also of this video in the comments. And I hope you all stay safe and are happy, and I hope you have a nice day. And I'll see you sometime in the future. Bye bye and bye panada.